Lance Collins is a director at Partner Energy with over 20 years of experience in architecture, urban design, and sustainable design consulting. A licensed architect in California, Lance has provided design and consulting solutions for various types of buildings, including institutional, office, mixed use, retail, schools, and multifamily residential. Lance has led the completion of more than 50 green certified projects, including LEED Platinum and Zero Net Energy for new buildings and existing construction for Partner Energy clients. Thank you so much for sharing with us today, Lance.
Great, thank you, Sean. Thank you for the invitation to be a part of this, and definitely I'm honored and humbled to be a part of this long list of fantastic speakers as well too. Great job by Ruby and Will and everybody today. Been interesting to hear everybody's different input on zero net energy and decarbonization and all those sorts of things. So I'm going to kind of jump right in. I always, the least favorite part of all these presentations is the speaker introduction. I feel like you could just say hi and we could go. But thank you for that, Sean. I guess where I wanted to start today is to kind of, with the preface, to say that this isn't really going to be a presentation about switching out your gas-fired boiler for a heat pump hot water heater, or specifying what size solar panels to install on your projects. We could talk about that, but really what I want to talk with you guys about today is understanding the potential that decarbonization has to be used as a tool for social environmental justice, and in particular as it impacts communities of color all across California and nationwide and worldwide. So let me see, here we go. Okay, the first thing I wanted to start with is just an acknowledgement of the climate emergency. And I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, so I'm gonna go through this real quick, but the United Nations and federal governments have taken the formal step of acknowledging a climate emergency that we all need to respond to with a sense of urgency that will mitigate and decrease the impacts of global warming by reducing CO2 emissions. And decarbonization provides a great tool to do that. The other thing I want to acknowledge is we have a public health emergency called racism that we're dealing with simultaneously, and actually a third one, COVID, which we're not yet done with, but specifically looking at racism that we've certainly seen amplified over the past 18 months, but has been a sort of foundational piece of the society we've created here in the United States for over 500 years. And I think on the positive perspective, we've now gotten to the point where over 100+ cities and states have recognized racism as a public health emergency, so that in turn, as a society, we can respond with an urgency to take actions, to make changes, to access capital in a way that can combat a lot of the negativity of racism, racial bias that we've experienced throughout in perpetuity almost. So I kind of want to start with those two things as acknowledgements of simultaneous struggles that need to be addressed in parallel. The other thing I want to kind of talk about, and Ruby and Will touched on this a little bit, so thank you for that as well. But a couple of just definitions of things I'm gonna keep coming back to throughout the presentation here. Obviously, the definition of decarbonization is reducing CO2 emissions resulting from human activity in the atmosphere, and switching from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources. I think we're hopefully all in agreement on that. The other definition I think is important here is what the California Utility Commission defines as a disadvantaged community. And it's a community where residents are predominantly people of color or living on low incomes, underrepresented in the policy setting or decision-making process, subject to disproportionate impact from one or more environmental hazards, likely to experience disparate implementation of environmental regulations and socioeconomic investment. And these communities, often largely composed of renters, have been left out of California's push towards clean energy solution. So that's what the CPUC defines as a disadvantaged community. I think that's important to think about all of those bullet points there when we talk about decarbonization. Something that's been interesting, of particular interest to me in recent months, but probably for the majority of my career, is the sort of parallel pathway that the social justice and environmental justice movement have taken over time. Going back to the 60s and 70s, you had, the creation of Earth Day and the civil rights movement. And, as we saw, last summer going on to today, we have social justice protests in the streets and we have environmental justice protests in the streets. And I think there's a lot of synergy between those two movements. And to me, the sort of most foundational piece in that is benefiting the people, through making changes from both a social justice and environmental justice perspective. So the next thing I kind of want to talk about was the history of inequity. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. You could spend hours on this section in of itself, but I think it's important to understand specifically the inequities that currently exist in our built environment, in particular in disadvantaged communities, that we can hopefully try to rectify or mitigate against for, through decarbonization going forward. So some of these you might be familiar with, some of these may be less obvious, but certainly the police brutality that has been seen in communities of color is an overt example of inequity based on so the use of force in communities where disproportionately high levels of murders, arrests, all these sorts of things have occurred as compared to sort of nationwide and statewide averages. Fence line communities are another example of inequity, where oftentimes communities of color are located adjacent to industrial facilities, manufacturing complexes, in areas that are sort of perceived as the less desirable land available in communities. You can go all the way back to the Firestone plant in South Los Angeles, which is sort of at the hub of what's now known as South Central Los Angeles. And it was located there, and homes were built right around that because it was close proximity to jobs in those areas. The other one on this list is the lack of green space, which is a result of lack of tax base in a lot of these communities, where cities and municipalities no longer have the ability to build parks and open space and provide shade trees, provide space for kids to play, and that certainly can have damaging impacts, not only from a mental and physical perspective, but also from a climate change perspective, because you have increased heat island impacts in these areas when you don't have green space in these underserved communities. And finally, the last one on this list is food deserts. In particular, in a lot of Black and brown communities, you have a disinvestment by corporations, banks, etc. So you have minimal resources available to you to provide fresh foods and clean water. And oftentimes the liquor stores and convenience stores are the most prevalent sources of getting food to a household. And so, with that disinvestment, by financial institutions and others, you have sort of the ripple effect of increased negative health impacts, increased, conditions of asthma and other sort of things like that that can have long-term negative repercussions on communities. So a couple people mentioned it already, but here's an example of what the Cal Enviro Screen environmental justice map looks like for Southern California. You can see it starts to measure things, particulate matter, hazardous chemicals, environmental impact effects, sensitive populations, socioeconomic factors. if you had to guess without me even saying anything where the Black and brown and disadvantaged communities are, you could almost put your finger on the map at any of the sort of red and orange communities illustrated here to understand those are also the same communities that have the highest level of environmental effects and have the most sensitive populations, have the most negative socioeconomic factors associated with them. So this data is available through the Cal EnviroScreen program, and it is certainly really important to understand the communities that have the most challenges and have the greatest need for improvement. The inequities can be seen in a number of different sort of forms of data. This is a series of tables from an organization called Race Counts that looks at sort of indicators of the healthy built environment by racial breakdown. And so you can see sort of percentage of people diagnosed with asthma, highest among the Native American community, second highest in African American, all the way down Asian having the best rate. Proximity to hazards within 1,000 to 3,000 feet of sensitive land use. Latino has the highest, Pacific Islander second, African American third, white has the best rate. Healthy drinking water, Asian and others have the highest, white second, Latino third, Latino fourth, Native American fifth, on down the list. And then highest percentage of toxic releases from facilities, Pacific Islander and Asian at the top, Latino third, Native American fourth, Black fifth. So, this is specifically for Los Angeles County. I'm sure you can run these numbers for any part of California and nationwide to look at that. But again, these are indicators for unhealthy built environments that can be improved upon and that can be mitigated against. So, what I'm proposing is really we should be looking at decarbonization not just as an engineering strategy, but as a tool for the future to really make a concerted change against environmental and social justice issues. And so yes, decarbonization can serve as a tool to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and reduce impacts on natural wildlife habitats by eliminating drilling and fracking and larger infrastructure, oil refineries and all those sorts of things. Yes, it can promote healthier air and water. Of course, we want all those things. Those fall under the environmental justice category. But I also believe that decarbonization can support increases in social equity and justice by providing green job opportunities, lowering utility costs and providing more housing security, increasing resident occupant health, increasing resiliency, and preserving cultural heritage. And so those are 5 that I've identified, but I'm sure there's probably more on that list of things that can be done immediately through decarbonization that can make an impact on the social justice perspective. So the first one I want to talk about is housing security. Ruby touched on this in her presentation and about sort of the significance of utility costs and what an extra $10 or $50 a month might mean for a family that is struggling to pay the bills or different things. I've been fortunate enough to participate on the project teams on a lot of affordable housing developments, and I'm always inspired by the stories I hear of residents who are able to move into permanent housing for the first time in many years and have a place they can call home and have low utility rates and be able to take that first step on the pathway to financial stability, family stability, mental health, all these sorts of things. And you take the example of a project that installs solar panels on its roof and is able to use the California utility allowance calculators to monetize that solar PV production and decrease their utility costs from $30, $40, $50 a month to $9 a month, $10 a month. That extra income on a family, whether it's a single parent or an individual, that extra income on a monthly basis can go a tremendous ways into providing access to childcare. Hey, now we can afford to send our kids to daycare, or provide more healthier foods instead of going to the convenience store or a fast food restaurant to provide dinner for your family. You may have the ability to go get fresh fruits and vegetables for your family. Also, a lot of transit-oriented development projects, that are also, all promoted around, let's say, the Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities grant programs, not only promote electrification and decarbonization, but increase access to transit, which again, specifically here in California, is a huge monthly expense for everybody of all income levels. And so if you can minimize those expenses, again, you increase the level of security that a family or an individual may have. Not only that, again, promoting open space, a lot of the new affordable housing developments that you see out there also come with community spaces, child play areas, all kinds of different things to provide services on site to keep families together, to give kids access to study, facilities, physical fitness, all these different things. So, housing security through the strategy of decarbonization is a critical path to allow people to feel more justice, to better balance the scales of social equity for everybody to benefit equally. Occupant health is the next category I kind of want to touch on. We talk about certainly decarbonization and electrification, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but I guarantee you, if you go to South Central Los Angeles, South Oakland, any Black and brown community, and you talk about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, people may not know what you're talking about and probably most certainly don't care about what you're talking about because it doesn't affect them on a day-to-day basis. But what does affect people on a day-to-day basis is health. Do I have asthma? Can my kids go play outside because the air quality is good or bad? Do we have access to fresh foods and clean drinking water? All those sorts of things. And so through electrification, through decarbonization, you can start to eliminate all the combustion appliances. You can, include filtration for outside air into a home. You can have carbon monoxide sensors in your building connected to all of your commitment in a smart home to help people understand it. Hey, is it safe to go play outside? Do we have, harsh chemicals in our house from paints and sealants, adhesives, all those sorts of things? Do we have clean water in our home? All those elements can be, the awareness of all those elements can be raised to provide occupant health. And I think in particular, when it comes to decarbonization, and one of the most common conversations is the additional cost associated with adding solar or heat pump hot water heaters or whatever the strategy is. But we also have to talk about the added cost of health, added cost of emergency room visits, urgent care visits, of medications, all these different things that come from poor health. So if we're building an environment, building homes for people that contain harsh chemicals, that have gas leaks, have poor ventilation, so they're taking in outside air from adjacent manufacturing and industrial facilities, we are increasing the cost on the healthcare system. We might save $100 on upfront construction costs, but we are increasing the cost and strain on our healthcare system. The next thing I want to talk about is resiliency. Sorry, my dog decided he wanted to participate in the conversation as well too. Resiliency is really important in the conversation as well too. I think as many people have experienced over the recent years with all the wildfires and earthquakes and everything, it is really a drain on infrastructure when Southern California Edison's system goes down, or any infrastructure goes down. People can be severely impacted in a way where medications are not able to be refrigerated, where people don't have air conditioning, are subject to other health impacts associated with heat stroke and dehydration, all those sorts of things. So resiliency and the process of decarbonization and providing electric infrastructure, battery backup can be a critical element in helping communities be more resilient and be more resistant to any natural disasters and unexpected events going forward. Some simple things such as having solar panels on your roof and connected to a battery storage system for a senior citizen that may be at a greater risk to heat stroke or dehydration could be a critical life-saving measure. again, we're part of this equation is talking about reducing carbon dioxide emissions, but we're also talking about public health and life safety measures as well too. So wildfire mitigation, flood mitigation, and heat event mitigation are all really critical parts of this conversation as well too. And I think what doesn't get talked enough about in the decarbonization discussion is the economic impacts of creating green jobs, about installing more solar panels, switching from gas infrastructure to all electric infrastructure. The economic implications of creating these job opportunities, whether it's for new construction projects or retrofitting existing buildings, and particularly in disadvantaged communities, can become an engine of itself for community investments, infrastructure upgrades for municipalities that can provide opportunities for jobs, for education, for community members, to give them alternative pathways. Oftentimes people look around and say, I don't have access to jobs, I don't have the right training I need to get access to the career that I want to have. But this strategy of decarbonization can open up a new door to see that. And I think we saw that going back to whatever that was, 2008 and 2009, with a lot of the green job training that came with the ERA funds here in California and nationwide. And I think we're looking at another opportunity to revisit that strategy where people can receive training, workforce development, and provide new career pathways for their own economic and individual advancement going forward. So again, not only reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but promoting economic prosperity and community investments. The first slide that I showed about inequity is about the disinvestment in Black and brown communities in particular. A lot of financial institutions, banks, lenders, real estate developers, property owners can look at opportunities for investing in communities now because of the demand for decarbonization, and the jobs and homes and everything that comes with that. I think would be a win-win across the board. And the last one on this list that I think is really important, that probably doesn't get talked about enough as far as a benefit to decarbonization, is cultural heritage. I think the precedent exists when when communities are disenfranchised, when disinvestment occurs in the community, when job opportunities don't exist, and housing cost increases and transportation cost increases, you see a community that often migrates to other areas looking for job opportunities and lower costs. You see gentrification in a lot of Black and brown communities in particular right now throughout the Southern California area. And when that happens, you lose a lot of cultural landmarks. You lose a lot of sort of cultural identity in a community. So I think one thing that I think is possible out there is through decarbonization, through investment in communities, through lower utility costs, through more housing security, you have the ability to keep communities in place and continue to build on the historical and cultural legacies that have existed for hundreds of years. So the example I'm showing here on the screen is actually the 28th Street YMCA, which is in South Los Angeles, that was built in the early 1920s, 1930s by the Black architect Paul Revere Williams. And this building was recently retrofitted, I think about 2 years ago, to become affordable housing and community space as an all-electric building. And as a part of the retrofit of the building, it was obviously brought back to its original original design intent in there, and now serves as an icon in the community, in the African-American community in particular, not only of a beautiful building that represents the history of the African-American community in South Los Angeles, but also the legacy of one of the first African-American architects in Los Angeles that everybody can refer to and see, look what we've done here for the past 100 years. And so I think decarbonization and electrification presents that pathway for cultural heritage preservation and preserving neighborhood identity, because you will hopefully minimize gentrification and certainly minimize the exodus from Black and brown communities to other neighborhoods looking for lower costs and for safer spaces and all those sorts of things. So that's a lot. I guess I want to talk about next, where can we go and how do we take actions on social justice and decarbonization? Now, I've been fortunate enough in my career to work on a lot of projects that are starting to address these issues. And I say starting because I feel like we're all still at the starting line all the time with this. Obviously, net zero and LEED and individually solar PV and battery storage have all been around as strategies for a long time, but to see them hit the mainstream and see them implemented and have historical data on them at a large enough scale to make critical opinions on them, I think we're just getting to that level. And so we've worked on a number of projects at Partner Energy. We do a lot of affordable housing and done a number of buildings that are now becoming all electric, are net zero, near net zero, implementing battery storage. And we're getting to the point where we have, I think, a decent amount of lessons learned and best practices that we were developing to understand what's successful, where the hurdles are, where the challenges are in the process. So I thought I would share a few with you guys. First of all, decarbonization can be a tool to promote more than just sustainable built environments. It's got to be access to all. When we're talking about sustainability, sort of, earlier on in my career, 20 years ago, it was still viewed as a luxury item. Now, working with a lot of affordable housing, it's viewed as a mandatory item, things we have to do, but we need to think about it as something that we need to do to be more equitable for everybody across the board. And so in those conversations that we have, the first thing that has to be a part of the conversation is have to be talking about more than just switching from fossil fuel technology to electric systems. If that's all we're going to talk about is fuel switching, then we're missing the larger context, why decarbonization is important and the impact that it can have on an individual building and on the community as a whole. So whenever we talk about this with our clients, it's not just, hey, we're going to switch out this gas-fired technology for this electric technology. That cannot be the end of the conversation. Number two is you really have to talk about life cycle cost impacts when you're talking about decarbonization. If someone says, hey, this heat pump hot water heater is more expensive than this gas-fired boiler. Okay, that's true today. But if we're just looking at that from that perspective, that's not going to be a winning discussion. You got to look at the cost of the gas infrastructure in the building, out in the ground, associated with providing gas to that building. You have to look at the utility costs, net operating costs for the tenant, for an owner, over the life cycle of the building. You have to look at the health costs. We talk about, the cost of funding the program, whether it's tax credits or affordable housing, sustainable communities or other things, but we also have to understand the cost of public health programs. How much money do we spend on emergency room visits and urgent care visits every year, and public health programs that go towards, supporting unhealthy built environments. And so the costs have to be spread out across the entire cycle of the building. And really, in order to do that, you have to think about the costs outside the property line. So when you talk about health and resiliency, we're not just talking about, how much does this project cost, but what is the cost to the community? How much do they pay for transportation? How much do they pay for doctor's visits? How much does someone pay for childcare? How much do they pay for food? All of these things have to be evaluated. And then certainly, if there's a challenge from a resiliency perspective, what are the critical costs associated with that? So if the grid does go down, if transportation is not available, what are the costs for lost wages? What are the costs for, medical centers, all these sorts of things. So we need to start the conversations to be with a wider lens, to not just talk about a construction cost within a property line when we're talking about building healthier environments. One of my favorite / least favorite conversations with general contractors is, well, this is more expensive than what we did on our last project, because they're looking at what net zero can be or decarbonization can be as an add-on. Hey, we're going to take the example of the building we built last year and we're going to add on a bunch of stuff to it. And yes, it's going to cost more. And that is absolutely not the right way to think about a project. We should not be thinking about adding something on to a building we did last year or 5 years ago. We should be thinking about changing the way we build our buildings, taking out pieces from gas infrastructure to roof framing for solar, all kinds of different things you should be looking at from a life cycle and holistic perspective, so that when you're talking about value engineering, we're not value engineering back to a building that was 3 years old that is now obsolete, but comparing it to what is a healthy building, what is a more environmentally friendly and socially conscious building. That should be the baseline, not a 3-year-old or 5-year-old building based on previous code cycle and previous best practices. So that's a conversation that I feel like I have on a weekly basis with general contractors and owners across the board. The fifth one on the list is really probably the hardest one that I'm dealing with on a day-to-day basis right now, is that codes and policies need to keep up with all the technologies and the demand. So, I know Will just had a great presentation on what the 2022 code and future code considerations might be. But we still have a lot of challenges right now today with understanding, how do we get a certain technology to comply with the code? So you mentioned in your previous presentation about ADUs and making a future exemption for, electric tankless hot water heaters. That's a current challenge that we have right now. We're doing a number of ADU projects that are looking to be all electric to have minimal, carbon emissions. But their only choice from a hot water heating perspective is a heat pump hot water heater, which doesn't always is not always the best fit for a 300 square foot ADU. So, we need the codes and the policies to keep up. There's a lot of technology for, PTAX and other things that are used in Canada and Europe and Australia that we can't use here in California, that would help us push more toward decarbonization to more equitable buildings, but the codes and the policies have not yet caught up with that. So we need to think about how do we move in a fashion, whether it's exemptions, whether it's alternative compliance methods, whether it's sort of a baseline zero code idea of alternative ways that we could meet some of these goals today to meet the demand of the people without having to wait for policy and legislation and code cycles every 3 years. So that's a challenge we have today. Certain clients ask for things from us that we just can't deliver on because we can't show code compliance, or a city planning department won't allow it, or whatever the case may be. And then last but not least on this list is education. Ruby touched on this. Everybody, I'm sure, has touched on this. Education is still really critical. We talk to property managers who say, we don't want to do this because it's something we've never maintained before, and it's going to increase our maintenance costs. Residents who are unaware or are against, all electric appliances because they want, natural gas for cooking, their meals. So with education is always a critical part of everything we do. Educating investors who are going to be paying for projects to help them understand life cycle costs and different ways they can increase their revenue and attract different types of funding sources by pursuing some of these strategies is really critical. I had a conversation with an investor 2-3 days ago talking about social justice issues, and they are pursuing funds $100+ million at a lower rate of return, 5, 6, 7% rate of return instead of a 15% rate of return, because their investors because they understand job creation and public health. And so this particular group is on sort of, I would say, the cutting edge, but that's still an educational process of helping people understand other things that bring value to a project instead of just what's the highest rate of return we can get on this building. And so education is always going to be critical. And so I'll close with just.
Lance, I apologize. They're just at 3:07, and so I wanted to let you know that David is waiting in the wings.
You got it. I'm going to close right now and say, I believe, and I hope you guys all believe, that decarbonization is a pathway to correct a lot of the inequities that have existed in communities of color for generations, from not only an environmental perspective, but also economic, health, safety, and cultural identity perspective. So with that, I will close, and if there's any questions, I'm happy to take any questions, and here's my contact information if you guys want to follow up afterwards as well.
Thank you, Lance. That was we've only had a chance to talk on the phone a couple times previously, and it was just a pleasure to see the full fruit of your intellectual efforts there. That was fantastic, and really lovely projects, of course. And sometime we should chat about the QAC, since we're both really into it, and see I think there's some improvements that could be made in its flexibility and showing, like you were saying, like how do we get it so that it shows some of the most advanced practices? Is there a way that's outside of code, like the QAC for affordable housing, that we might be able to do experimental stuff? Yeah.
Yeah,
Or
I'm sure there are lots of room for improvement in the QAC and
yeah.
different things, but it is something we see a lot and we push on as a tool for developers and builders to help them understand at least how to monetize one thing that creates value on their end, but also has a significant impact for residents as well too.
Yeah. So I'm looking forward to that. If you could head over to the chat if you wanted to address some comments that have come in.